this point, every information portal is saturated with mindfulness content. But this show is a unique, unusual, curious take on mindfulness. Some of what you hear will be completely new to you. Let's dive in and take a look at the nature of the aware mind. I invite you to deepen your awareness so that you may be liberated and inspired.
We are here with Sarah Vallely, mindfulness teacher, coach, and author. Sarah has been teaching meditation and mindfulness for the past 2 decades, training and certifying others to teach mindfulness. Sarah is the author of 4 books. Her latest book is titled Tame, Soothe, Dwell, the 55 Teachings of TSD Mindfulness. Today, we discuss the neurology associated with meditation and mindfulness. We discuss the health benefits for your thinking, your mood. We also discuss what the atoms of thoughts are on a neurological level. I am Jacob DeRosset. We are here with Sarah Vallely. Sarah, how are you?
I'm great, Jacob. Thank you. We know there are so many benefits from meditation. It prevents depression, lowers anxiety, improves cardiovascular health, is better for our immune system, grows gray matter in our cerebellum. These are all things that we've talked about on past episodes. Yes, we know we have all these benefits from mindfulness, but why? Like, what is the missing link? What if I just sit and do nothing? Will I get these benefits? Do I specifically need to practice mindfulness to gain these benefits? This is a question that I get often. On a cognitive level, it works because you're strengthening your ability to concentrate, you're strengthening your ability to accept, you gain more clarity, you gain more patience. So on a cognitive level, this can explain why we're having some of these benefits, such as preventing depression and lowering anxiety. When I used to answer this question, what if we just sat and did nothing? Would we get the same benefits? I used to explain the reason that you need to actually practice mindfulness is because mindfulness pulls you out of the default mode network. And basically that is parts of your brain that are active at a certain time. And this default mode network, these certain areas in your brain are active when you are daydreaming, when you are having stream of consciousness. And what the mindfulness does is it pulls you out of that, which is important because there's a lot of research that shows if we spend too much time in that default mode network, when our brain is activated in that certain arrangement, that it causes depression, it causes anxiety.
Does being in the default mode network cause depression and anxiety, or do you go to the default mode network because you were depressed or anxious?
Going into that default mode network causes depression and anxiety.
That's fascinating.
Rumination is one of the biggest reasons, because when you're in the default mode network, the majority of the time when you're in this default mode network, you are either in rumination or worry. When we practice mindfulness, we pull ourselves out of that type of thought cycle. To answer this question, what if we just sat and did nothing? Would we get the same benefits? So I did some investigation and read some more research, and I was absolutely blown away by what I uncovered in the depths of these published research article indexes. I'm super excited to unveil these. I feel like I am unveiling the secrets to the universe. This is how excited I am about this. Here's one relative aspect, is our brain waves. Our brain waves are oscillating electrical voltages in the brain, measuring a few millionths of a volt, right? So we can actually measure the voltage of these brain waves. You might have heard of them: alpha, beta, delta, gamma. Those are different brainwave states. They're differentiated by how many cycles per second that their frequency is. So I've been teaching about brainwaves for years. I've talked about it in one of my books. It's been part of several of my trainings, but it wasn't until the last few days that I learned these brainwave states can be run at different voltages. So Jacob, you could be in an alpha state and be running the alpha state at one certain voltage, and I could be in the alpha state and running at a different voltage. What the research shows is that meditators exhibit more volts across the board in every state while they're meditating compared to somebody who's not. So if somebody's just sitting there doing nothing and they're checking their brain waves, they're emitting a little bit less voltage than somebody who's sitting there and practicing mindfulness.
What is the benefit of having more volts than having less?
Well, what I'm thinking when you put all this together is the reason that we are preventing depression, lowering our anxiety, improving cardiovascular health. One of the reasons that this is happening is quite possibly because when we meditate, we're running at higher volts. I mean, there's nobody out there that's specifically saying that, but that's a difference between somebody who's just sitting there resting compared to somebody who's actually meditating. There's more volts. So we can just kind of speculate. Well, the largest difference that I saw between the voltages of someone sitting at rest and someone meditating was 10 to the negative 12th power microvolts. So it's not a lot, but when you look at it on the chart, like it looks significant. So you are literally generating more power when you're practicing mindfulness than someone who's just sitting there resting. So maybe we could plug ourselves into the grid and give the power back, make some money.
That sounds great. Yeah. I mean, it kind of makes sense if you think of that somebody's system is just more efficient than the other person's, that you have more things happening. And if you have more things happening, that's going to aid in your entire system. That's pretty cool.
I feel like this is like the future in research. Like, can we research this more and understand what does this mean? What are the implications of this? So that's one aspect, but there are so many physical and cognitive benefits of meditation, but why do we have to meditate, practice mindfulness? Why can't we just sit there and gain those same benefits? I've mentioned several times, when we practice mindfulness. So let me be more specific about what I mean when we practice mindfulness. There are two ways to practice mindfulness. If you're not doing either of these ways, you're not practicing mindfulness. You're doing something else, which is fine. But mindfulness is pretty specific. And one is single pointed focus, which means we are choosing a stimulus to focus on, whether that is sound, our breath, our physical sensations in our body. You can even have your eyes open looking at an object, right? That's single pointed focus. And when we lose our concentration, we just bring it back to whatever our stimulus is. That's one method. The other method is called open awareness. The researchers name it open monitoring. And what that is we sit and we pay attention to whatever comes into our consciousness. It could be a sound. It could be a physical sensation. It could be a thought, an emotion, and so forth. And so you're basically sitting there noticing each and everything that's coming through. Experienced, quote, advanced mindfulness meditators do both. They are typically focusing on maybe their breath, and at the same time, they're monitoring any thoughts that might come into their consciousness.
Where does uprooting the notions of the typical sense of self come in? One of the biggest shifts that I had in my practice was when I started really leaning into practices that cause you to uproot your idea of what you think that you are, which, in Buddhism, the big draws, you're not what you think you are. I think Jack Kornfield said, you're real, but you're not really real. And I've always loved that.
That's one of the major difference between single pointed focus and open awareness. Is open awareness is a practice in you getting to know yourself.
Yeah.
Right. When we're practicing single pointed focus, we are not getting to know ourselves other than we might be getting in touch with our concentration level. Like, oh, I'm really good at concentration, or, oh, my concentration is a little bit challenged. But with open awareness, we are learning so much about I like the term you used in the past, Jacob, the nature of the mind. Yeah. So with open awareness, we're really learning the nature of the mind. I've attained enlightenment 3 times, and none of those times was I using open awareness.
Yeah.
I was using single pointed focus each of those times. But I don't know about other meditators because I've never heard another meditation teacher speak about their enlightenment experience. So I don't know if this is just particular to me.
So when you say enlightenment, or you mean specifically like stream entry type experiences, awakening experiences, or
the no self?
Oh, yeah.
So getting to a point where you completely don't even know that you are you. Like, that's gone. Yeah. You're the fan, you're the wall, you're the tree. You've completely let go.
I've touched things that felt like that for just the smallest second. But for me, every time that I have this change of my ground of being, I know it's something that Sam Harris always talks about is when you're looking at a window, you can look through the window to the other side, or you can see your reflection in the window. a lot of meditation practices are having you just look at your reflection. But if I tell you to look through the window outside at the tree, now you have a shift in perception. So when I've had that experience and had that shift, those are the times that I'm like, well, okay, there's something here. I really like the psychedelic nature of losing yourself. That's what I'm in it for.
So returning to the conversation about why do we need to actually sit and meditate and practice mindfulness to gain these physical and cognitive benefits, opposed to just sitting there, just resting and relaxing, letting our mind wander. One of the really important aspects to understanding this has to do with what are called microstates. Microstates are determined by which areas of the brain are activated during rest. So there's about 6 of these microstates. One is, for example, the right frontal lobe and the left posterior lobe are activated. So that's one configuration. Another is the frontal lobe and the occipital lobe is activated, right, in this configuration. So there are about 6 different configurations that our brain activates in during rest. They actually term these microstates to the atoms of thought. You know, if we were going to break down our thoughts to the most smallest brain activity, it would be these microstates. But sometimes during rest, we aren't in any of these states. We are jumping from one configuration to the other because you're not technically in a state unless you're there for 80 milliseconds or longer. So sometimes we're just jumping around, boom, 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 boom. We're not really landing for any period of time in a certain state. And they use EEG monitors to measure this. So here's the interesting part. The researchers are claiming that mental health is determined by your brain at rest. So if you can take a picture, monitor what is going on in your brain at rest, that indicates how you're doing with your mental health. And the reason that they claim this is because what our brain is doing when we're at rest gets you ready for sensory input, influences your perception, and affects your cognitive processing. So I'm going to repeat that. The researchers are claiming that mental health is determined by our brain at rest. What is happening on a neurological level in our brain when we are at rest? And there are studies that are associating different mental health disorders with this intermittent brain activity that I'm talking about this jumping around from these different states. I'm not going to list all the disorders, but anxiety disorders and panic disorders are on that list. There's a study that was published in the Frontiers of Human Neuroscience in 2016. What they did is they hooked up 3 groups of people to EEG machines and recorded their microstates. So the first group were people who don't meditate, are not meditators, and they were sitting there at rest, just taking a break. Another group were meditators. They have a meditation practice, but they weren't actually meditating. They were just sitting there resting. And the third group were meditators, people who have a practice in mindfulness who were meditating. This is what came out of that study. They took data on how many times the people went into the microstates. And the first group that were not meditators, they were just sitting there resting, went into microstates on average 3 times per second. The meditators who were sitting there just taking a break went into microstates 3.8 times per second. And the meditators who were actually meditating went into the microstates 4 times per second. So that's a 33% difference between the people who don't meditate, who are just sitting there resting, and then those who were meditating. So that's a really significant difference. So when you hear this, Jacob, what does this mean to you?
What I'm hearing is if you have a consistent meditation practice, even when you're sitting there and not meditating, your brain activity is going to reflect that of somebody that is a more healthy mental state at rest, perhaps. Yeah. How would you phrase that?
Well, yeah, because of these studies that are associating these mental health disorders with this intermittent activity, which means the people aren't going into these states as often, then yeah, I think that's fair to say that someone who has a meditation practice is probably less likely to have one of these mental health disorders. What this is really showing to me is that if you have a mindfulness practice, you have a permanent shift in your brain activity. It's not just like when you're meditating, oh, your activity is a little bit healthier. It's just like a permanent shift throughout your day. And I remember when this happened to me. It was about 10 years ago. I practiced mindfulness for 60 minutes every day for 9 months, and it changed my life. And I remember when I noticed that, like, this is like a permanent change. Like the first few months, I was like, okay, I'm starting to feel better, especially when I'm meditating. But I think it might have been around the 6th month. Like I realized that I had just a fundamental difference in my whole being.
So if you're somebody that's listening to this and you're saying to yourself, okay, I have a clinical level of depression or anxiety, I'm heavily medicated, and I don't think that mindfulness is going to help. The answer is we definitively know it will help if you do it the way that, Sarah has outlined, and you really consistently do it. You will get better. And then the more you practice, the more better it'll get. To me, all this is just telling you, just start, just do it consistently over time, and you are guaranteed a result, right? It's like lifting weights. If you lift weights, you will get stronger. It is not even if you do it poorly and incorrectly, you will still get stronger. You could go into a gym with no idea what you're doing and literally just take dumbbells off the rack and set them on the floor and put them back and do that every day. You will get stronger for sure. Just doubling down on, we now know definitively your mental health will improve if you practice mindfulness regularly. For sure. Full stop.
Yeah. And you had mentioned medications. The research shows that meditation alone nor medication alone, right? We say it again because they sound so similar. Neither meditation alone nor medication alone are as effective as combining meditation and medication. You can do both. Get I've better bang for your buck.
The medication helps you to take the burden off of you just enough that you can start to implement positive lifestyle habits. Cold showers, getting up early, light exposure, exercise, social interactions, all those things.
I feel like we're like, this is the Jacob and Sarah pep talk show. Yeah. So going back to that research that I was mentioning, also what they measured were the amount of time the people in the study were in the microstates. So the control group, the group that was just sitting there doing nothing, they didn't have a meditation practice. On average, they were in each microstate for about 95 milliseconds. The group that were meditators, but were not meditating while they were getting measured, they were just sitting there at rest, their average time for being in a microstate was 120 milliseconds. And then the group of meditators have had a practice of meditation, and they were practicing mindfulness while they were getting measured, were in the microstates on average 130 milliseconds. So first of all, that's a 37% difference between the people who didn't meditate and who were just sitting there at rest. That's a huge difference. And it's a pretty fairly big jump up from the people who were not meditating. I think it was the same group of people. I think they just took the meditators and they measured them once where they were just sitting there doing nothing. And then they measured them again when they were meditating. It looks as though when you practice meditation on a regular basis and you meditate, you go into the microstates about the same amount as you would if you weren't meditating. But when you're meditating, you're in those microstates for longer periods of time. And if you've ever been on a retreat or you have a really dedicated mindfulness practice, what you experience is things slow down. Everything just seems to slow down. You're like in slow motion. And so I think this is what explains that. You're literally like your brain activity is literally slowing down. You're entering these microstates in a more stable way for longer periods of time, which I think is allowing you to experience your reality in more of slow motion. Some of my clients don't like it when I point this out, but I think some of us who are in these like really busy lives and things seem like we can't catch up and we're overwhelmed. I think there's a big part of that that's actually just our own brain function, that because we're jumping around between these different states, we're experiencing our life as just super fast and we can't catch up. I mean, I know that some of us have lives where there's just so much going on, but I think if you were to slow that down, your life would not feel as if it was going as fast. Have you experienced that, Jacob?
On an experiential level, I didn't notice like I've slowed down. I more or less I notice more things. Like I think Ram Dass said, I've become a connoisseur of my neuroses. It just helped me to not take myself so seriously, because once you start and you examine all the thoughts that you have, it's like, wow, okay, really? This is it? Like, this is the best I got, it's like, you're a human. People have more or less of some things, but everybody has the full spectrum of the humanness. For me, setting was examining that and being like, oh, okay, well, I see all these things now. Here they are. And then when I'm out and about in public and I say something, I make a joke that falls flat or whatever, I'm just like, oh, well, what are you going to do?
A couple other points of interest in this study. They took data on the number of years that the people had been meditating, how long their practice was. And the longer the people had been meditating, the more often they went into these states and the longer they were able to hold these states. And it also matters which of these 6 states you spend time in. Also, that's an additional factor of leading to these health benefits. I won't go into all of the 6 states, but I'll give an example here. That one of the most beneficial out of the 6 microstates is microstate C. They are labeled A, B, C, D, E, F. And in this microstate C, we have lower activity in our anterior cingulate cortex, which has to do with being impulsive. So if we have less activity in that area, then that would make sense. That would be helpful. And there's also less activity in the thalamus, which I think is helpful because the thalamus breaks your attention 4 times per second on average. And the reason the thalamus breaks your attention is it's scanning your environment for threats. So you probably feel a little bit more relaxed if that thalamus isn't engaged as much. And also there's lower activity in the insula, which has to do with arousal, getting emotionally excited, has to do with decision-making and being emotional overall. So that would make sense that having lower activity in that center would be helpful. And then there's higher activity in this microstate C, there's higher activity in the anterior and posterior cerebellum, which is highly associated with mindful movement, being intentional about how we're moving our bodies and also cognitive functions. So I don't know, what do you think? Is it plausible that on a very physical, neurological level, staying in these microstates for a longer period of time and being in the microstates more often, do you think this is what's supporting us to have all of these health and cognitive benefits from our mindfulness practice?
That makes sense to me. I've wondered that, like, how is it that mindfulness is good for your immune system? It makes almost no sense if you just think about it from an experimental standpoint, that what about sitting down and focusing or being aware is good for my immune system? They seem completely unrelated. So yeah, I would say that drawing that conclusion makes the most sense of anything I've heard so far. So basically, the longer you meditate, the more positive brain things are going to happen. That's my redneck way to describe what you just said. So the longer you meditate, then the more positive brain states you will receive from your practice.
Yes, I would say that's true. I will list the studies that I used to put together this information in the blog.
The Aware Mind podcast is a TSD mindfulness production. Please visit our website at tsdmind.org. That is T as in tame, S as in soothe, and D as in dwell. Mind as in mindfulness.org. Check out our blog post for this episode with links to supplemental information such as worksheets you can use to put into practice the mindfulness skills shared in this episode. Also, please sign up for our newsletter and receive mindfulness tips. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram at aware_mind_podcast. Thank you.